Yesterday, November 16th, was what would have been the 70th birthday of Terence McKenna, who sadly passed away at age 53 in the year 2000. And he's someone who, as a thinker and a speaker, and someone left behind a great body of work to consume and to be challenged by and to pick apart, was quite an influence on my own life and remains so, and is entirely vivid in that respect in terms of how important his ideas were. And his first and foremost quality that allowed him to attain such status was he was a phenomenal orator. This is a man who could hold forth at the drop of a hat and with no notes and make it interesting to listen to topics where he would tease apart, things about human history, about anthropology, pharmacology, psychedelia, the occult, virtual reality, epistemology, eschatology. This is a guy who could just talk about seemingly anything, and he would have such a rich understanding of it, and he'd have his own novel ideas he'd come to, and he'd weave in information he'd picked up over the years from sometimes entirely quixotic different areas and sources and thinkers and people he'd known in his lives. And what's interesting is this talent he had for holding forth like this and for incorporating all the things he knew and his ideas and weaving it together into a tapestry of interesting conversation and discussion and monologues and talks and speeches is actually something that I remember he commented on, saying that during his time as a student back in the days in the 60s in Berkeley, actually there were numerous people who would do this. They would sit around, they would smoke cannabis, they would hold forth for hours, they would talk about things they were interested in, they would have salons where they discuss things. And this is certainly a skill, but that's the point I want to stress here. It's not just some talent that only one or two people could ever have. Now, certainly the level he took it to was phenomenal. It was an absolutely unbelievable ability to speak like this. But I know for myself, I wasn't such a good public speaker initially. It's something that, yes, it requires a good memory, but it requires work to make use of all the information you're picking up so that it has multiple connections and that the connections remain fresh and multitudinous, however you would say that word, so that there's many ways to get to the information and they all have different significances that aren't just one piece you read in a book here that you forget about, and then the ability to weave it together and have confidence to do so. This is someone where the main method of consuming his ideas in the modern age is by listening to talks of him online. Now, what's interesting is when I first discovered this guy was before there was a million YouTube videos of him. In fact, it was back when YouTube didn't even exist. I remember I downloaded what is now quite a famous pack of MP3s called the She Who Remembers Archive of Terence McKenna or something to that effect. And it was maybe, 20 or 30 talks, and they all had different names on the files. And these talks were fantastic. It was hours and hours of material, and I listened to them over and over again. I used to listen to them while I was listening on an MP3 player, and I'd walk around, and when I would be going to the shop, I'd be listening to him, and when I'd be doing some work, I'd be listening to him, or when I was just chilling out, I'd sometimes be listening to him. And interestingly enough, at the time, I used to search all the time, there wasn't much else out there. There wasn't a lot of talks out there. You saw them on the internet. Some people had talks on cassette that they were selling from certain places and that were out there. I think like Sounds Photosynthesis or something was the name of a site that had some stuff for sale. But at the time, I didn't have a lot of money. I wasn't going to go out there and search for this stuff. I didn't think it was possible to get it. And also it was based in America. And so now there's many more talks available. Now, famously, you can go to what's called the Psychedelic Salon, and they have podcasts regularly there where they not only curate old talks, some of them that were in these packs here, but also bring forth new talks that people have sent into this guy, because Terence McKenna did many, many workshops and talks around the world that people recorded over, we're talking 20, 25 years span. And so there's many, many out there, and we keep getting new ones all the time. And so if you're interested in him, there is more coming all the time if you go to that particular site there. And what's interesting about his talks is they're not the kind that you just listen to once and you go, okay, some interesting ideas there. I'll think about it. Right, I'll move on. You can listen to them again and again. And what's interesting is even though many of them will share the same topics and he'll go into these little wraps within them that you've heard parts of, there'll often be a little difference to it, or when you're listening to it now, having gone away and read books that are on these topics or investigated them or thought about these things and challenged yourself, you'll come back and you'll find that because you bring more to the table, you take more away, you get more out of the talks because you're listening to them again and you're a changed person. You're not the same person you were before. You can never step in the same stream twice. It's that kind of philosophy, that principle that's at work here. Beyond being an amazing orator, if he was just someone who's very entertaining to listen to, yeah, that would have its own value just in terms of as a bard, as someone you could sit down, you could listen to, you can get enjoyment out of. But this guy was a fantastic thinker as well, a very novel thinker. You could give him practically any topic and his mind would come to novel and interesting and fresh conclusions, or connect two pieces of information or two hemispheres that experts within those fields separately might have ideas that might be connected, but they wouldn't have any way of knowing that there was any connection between the two of them. And because he'd gone into all these different areas, he was able to make these connections between them. I mean, this is best seen where if anyone at the end of his talks during when he'd have Q&A sessions put a question to him, I don't think I've ever heard this guy get legitimately stumped. As in, it's not that he knew the answer. I mean, funnily enough, he's someone who didn't really think you could necessarily know answers and there was a right answer or not. He's someone where he could give you something if you asked him the question, though. He could say, right, that makes me think of this, or I would model it like this, perhaps. And he'd always be able to come up with some interesting way of describing, even if he didn't have some sort of particularly firm answer or some strong conclusion he could draw on that topic. I mean, again, another example is when he did his trialogues with Ralph Abram and Rupert Sheldrake, people who were experts and high-level thinkers in their own fields, which were not Terence's field. They could put questions to him. They could spin things on their own expertise, and he'd come up with his own witty and funny and novel way of answering these questions. So one of the amazing things about this guy is he seemingly had an exhaustive avenue of inquiry, because he had looked into all these different areas that he called fringe areas, and that were to do with philosophy and the way we think and ancient cultures and things that are out there like the UFO phenomenon or the occult and other such things. And if you want to go and see kind of the depth to which this guy had investigated these areas, when his library unfortunately was burned down long after he died, someone actually found a listing of all the books. Someone found some, I think from when he was moving it or something, there was some sort of a paper list of all the books he had in his collection. And you can find it online. Like, I'll put a link in the description box below, and you'll see how incredibly exotic and quixotic and unique and occult and in-depth and very specific and academic sometimes all the works that this guy had, and the kind of the food that he'd fed his brain to be able to get to this position where then his unique personality came to these incredible and interesting and novel conclusions. He's a guy who wrote books. He didn't write many books, but his books all had some purpose to them. Like Food of the Gods is probably, in my opinion, the best book. It's one which attempts to study how human civilization, throughout all the eras that there was culture and civilization, had relationships with drugs, with pharmaceutical, well, not pharmaceutical, but with pharmacology, essentially, with the world of different chemicals and how they interacted with us. It goes through eras here. Yes, in the early days, he's talking about how mushrooms were used and drugs used by shamans in the past. And then he goes to eras where, for example, they were supposedly, I think it was in like Nineveh, they were supposedly using opium to some ridiculous degree, so that they initially, when they found the initial like counting of what they thought was actually corn, because it was so prevalent, it was actually opium. That's how much these guys were into that shit. Then you go to eras where we're moving towards like the times when the British Empire, etc., these sorts of times where the culture was actually hooked on sugar, and it was hooked on caffeine and red meat. And you're going through the eras and getting to the modern day where, yes, we've got psychedelics and we've got drugs like ketamine, etc. And so a very interesting book, because it goes all over the place, but it is less scholarly view and charting of the human relationship with drugs, but obviously not from a perspective of someone like, these are all harmful things that are negative influence. No, it's just telling the story of how it was. So that's probably, I think, his masterwork, his magnum opus as a book. Then he had The Archaic Revival, which was a pretty good book. This was a book where the premise was that he'd noticed that, much as in the Renaissance period, where they went back to the ancient Greek and Hellenistic periods for the philosophy and ideas and magical occult concepts, he noticed that in cultures, when they run into a crisis point, when they feel like, you know, the well of imagination has run dry, there's this thing where they reach back in time for what seemed to be the last sane point, the last working model, and they bring that forwards and they try and apply it now. So the Archaic Revival is about the fact that in modern culture, where we've become so disconnected from nature and the world that we lived as, 90,000, 100,000 years as humans before, the kind of societies we lived in before with small numbers and tribal and part of nature, because we're so disconnected from that, people feel this yearning, this hole, this disconnect from everything. And so it's talking about how the Archaic Revival is a way of reaching back into that past. And that's why people are so into things like tattooing, and they're into meditation, and they're into all these different unique things and expressing different gender traits, etc., and all these things, because it's actually some of the things that came from the tribal era, and it's a way of people trying to reconnect and try and rediscover what their identity is and their places, and establish and identify who they are in this world even that they live in, this absurd world that we live in. He had True Hallucinations, which was an account of when he and his brother went to La Chorrera in the Amazon rainforest in, I think it was 1973 or 1975, one of the two. And they went there, and basically while they were there, they were initially going, I think they said Yage, some sort of hallucinogen that they heard had been used down there, but they ended up going to this area where it had a lot of fresh growing psilocybin mushrooms, and so they took massive amount of psilocybin mushrooms, and his brother, which is one of the key elements of the story, famously had what seemed to be some sort of a psychotic break while on these mushrooms, but in which he came to some very novel ideas about time and the way humans process time and the nature of it in terms of language and how ideas can be decoded and what might be going on with the human DNA. And this, interestingly enough, plays into the last book that he wrote. I don't know if this is the chronology, I'm just saying last in my order, which is The Invisible Landscape. And this was about an idea that he got on mushrooms, coupled with what his brother was doing, the experiments he was doing in La Chorrera in the rainforest, which was that using what he'd already knew about the occult, he knew about the I Ching, these 64 coded hexagrams of ancient Chinese period, of some sort of Confucian era, and basically the King Wen sequence of it was some sort of key aspect to the mushroom, informing him of how he could unlock that into a blueprint or a map of how time operates. And I'll get to this later because it's called Time Wave Zero, what he did with it as a computer program. But the basic notion was, instead of looking at time as this disconnected, disjointed series of events, or like events that are always going up and up and things are getting better and better, it was a notion of mapping time in terms of novelty. And that at certain points of time, novelty is very high and incredible things are happening. Certain times it's very low and less is happening. Like the Dark Ages would obviously be a good period there. And this notion led into a theory, almost like an attempt at prophecy of what might happen in the future when we reach this 0 point of novelty, just going to the max, essentially. So beyond his books and his talks, the primary thing Terence McKenna is known for is his relationship as not an advocate, because that makes it sound like you're telling people you want to do it, but an advocate in the sense of telling people about what are the benefits, what are the good things, what is to be learned from psychedelics. Talking about hallucinogenic drugs here. And so his model, his analogy he'd always give, the metaphor, was of a fisherman going out into the dark sea, and the idea is, while you're on the drug, you want to put down your nets, you want to try and catch something, some sort of an idea that's not just meaningful while you're out there, but that you can take home to the shore and show to the people who didn't go out there on that boat with you, look what I found, look what I caught. But at the same time, while you're out there in those murky depths, you don't want to pull some huge whale or something that's going to wreck the boat and just destroy you. I mean, obviously the analogy here would be to people who've just destroyed themselves on psychedelics, or they've just come unraveled entirely. And that's kind of a good metaphor to take, because he never was just advocating everyone doing them all the time in some irresponsible manner. And so in terms of psychedelics, in terms of hallucinogenic drugs, the most key one that is associated with them is DMT, dimethyltryptamine. And this is a drug which actually comes from the Amazon, essentially, and it's probably the most powerful psychedelic ever discovered, and it only lasts 10-15 minutes, and people do it in a powdered form. You take a bunch of deep hits, and you don't just take a drug and experience weird colors or whatever. You're getting blasted off almost out of your mind, but as yourself, into another dimension, in which famously there was the notion that you encounter other entities or some other aspect either of yourself or some other thing. Something else is out there. There's a thing that you're aware of when you're in that space. And this is the notion of the machine elves. This is a famous thing he coined, because obviously when you're talking about a psychedelic of this length, where it's 10 minutes but it's incredibly intense and you're in another universe completely and you forget about this world, in that sense it's going to be almost impossible to fully explain that and to relate what the experience is like to someone who's never had the experience. And even if you've had the experience, maybe you can't say in words what the experience is like to someone else who had the experience so they can connect to it. So he came up with these like very vivid kind of poetic ways of describing it. And so one of them was this notion of the machine elves. These were the tykes, these little creatures, these entities that you would encounter while you were there. I mean, famously, his description was they were jeweled, self-dribbling basketballs. And one of the great things about his description of DMT, one of the best lines he probably had, is that this is such an incredible thing that it could even exist. Whether it's all in your mind or not, just the fact that this experience could exist and is accessible by this drug. The way he put it was, if aliens landed tomorrow on the White House lawn in, titanium ships from another planet, Zenebel Ganubi, I think is the one you would always say, that would still be page 2 news to page 1 should be DMT exists, anyone in theory can access this, and when you do, it'll make you question reality itself, not just yourself and the world. It'll make you think there are other realities or there's something else behind our reality. And so as a result, he is primarily the person responsible for DMT becoming such a known concept, and at least people being aware of it, and as a result, so many people then going on to do it. So just as Timothy Leary was incredibly influential on so many people learning about what LSD was and eventually doing LSD, I think that in this sense, Terence McKenna is the guy who went out there, and he in some sense was the Johnny Appleseed who put out there DMT, and now it is quite a famous thing. And if you've read a lot of art in the 20th century, the cyberpunk era, you will find that once you get to the 2000s, there's a lot of references to this. Grant Morrison's Invisibles. It's all over the place. A lot of magicians and people from the occult have gone over to the side and experienced it. And now obviously we know ayahuasca, by the way, uses DMT. And famously now a lot of people are going to the South American rainforest and they're taking retreats there. And there are even cults like the Santa Daime cult that are in America that are using ayahuasca. So to some extent, DMT has proliferated out of just being a rainforest thing. I mean, they didn't ever use it as like the powdered drug that was intense for the 15-minute trip. They used the ayahuasca approach, which is hours long, and he's the one who's popularized that and who's made people at least aware of it. He's increased the exposure of it. But beyond DMT, you notice a lot of his work actually is primarily focused around psilocybin. So this is the psilocybin cubensis mushroom, and this is the one that grows in Mexico primarily, with the one that he always often talked about. And his approach wasn't what a lot of people do, which is you go into nature, you just take a few mushrooms, you take a few caps, you take maybe like an eighth or something, and then you just have a cool time in nature, like talking to trees and stuff. His idea wasn't like that. It wasn't for recreational purposes. This was to explore the soul, to explore the mind, and to see where your mind goes when you just let it affect your mind and then kind of zone in on what's going on in the mind's eye, in the imagination, not what's happening externally, not what's being projected outwards, not how you interact with your world outside of you, the tangible 3D world. Instead, his notion was to take this heroic dose. And this is where you take 5 dried grams. Remember, the dried weight is about a tenth as much as the fresh weight. So this would be like 45 to 50 fresh grams, which is usually about 2 boxes of what you used to be able to buy in Amsterdam. And you would take these 5 dry grams and you wouldn't watch Pink Floyd's The Wall. You wouldn't watch an Alejandro Jodorowsky movie. You wouldn't watch cartoons or talk to a friend or listen to rock music. What you would do is you would arrange a period of time, 7 or 8 hours, when no one's going to interrupt you, no one's going to come to where you are. You would go into a room, you would turn off the lights, you would get comfortable, and in silent darkness with 5 grams, you would wait an hour 20 minutes till they kicked in, and you would have this experience. And one of the key things is, because when you do that, the experience is going to be even more powerful, because it's going to be all just you seeing inside your mind's eye, your imagination. You're going to get an experience that will be unlike if you have all the other data coming in. I would give the analogy, the metaphor would be like the flotation tank. When you're in the flotation tank, you're removing all other sensory information so that you are focused just on what's going on in the mind's eye, and that becomes vivid and it plays out across the canvas of this darkness. So that's what's going to happen here behind your closed eyes when you're in this silent darkness. And famously, he said, when you take these doses, what you do is you get the mushroom to speak to you. You wait until the effect's beginning and you tell it, hello, is someone there? You talk to it. And the idea is, whether it's your own internal narrator or in your mind's eye, some sort of a voice, something will speak to you, he says. And it will be this other, this whatever it is. Is it the mushroom? Is it the spirit of the mushroom? Is it some kind of an alien force? Is it some kind of external force coming in? Whatever it might be, his notion was that the other would interact with you at this point in time. And famously, he had this notion that he didn't necessarily know what it was. He didn't say it was an alien or God or himself or anything. I mean, famously, he did try to do a lot of things to check if it was himself, to see if it had information he had or whether it could proffer some kind of idea or piece of information he didn't have access to. And he had this famous line he said, where he said that, he had said to it before, okay, so you've shown me like what you are in terms of what you think I can handle. You're taking on a certain appearance or a certain notion or addressing me in a certain way that I as a human can handle, but what are you for yourself? And then famously, his notion was that when it shows you what it is and how it's just so utterly other, it's so outre, it's so bizarre, it's so alien that the human mind almost can't handle it, and you repel against it. You say, okay, go away now back to the dancing mice, back to kind of just like the psychedelic light show, I don't want to see that anymore. Go back to putting on your mask, putting on the disguise, which is obviously a very key concept about the notion of others and how they portray themselves to us. And he gave us these instructions on how you could use mushrooms in a very specific sense. Then obviously ayahuasca, which is related to DMT, was another thing he was helping to popularize. And something that was a regular part of his life was cannabis. This is a guy who was a daily smoker of large quantities of cannabis. And even though he used it recreationally on a daily basis, I mean, he said it made it more social and upped him up. He's also someone who, even in terms of cannabis, prescribed it in a different manner than other people would do it. So he didn't say smoke a bit and have fun and watch a silly movie and just listen to cool music and enjoy the music, which is the way a lot of people enjoy it, as a way to enhance things that they're doing anyway. No, his notion was, again, you smoke a lot of it as pure, as good as you can, as high THC content. So you talk about Lebanese hash or something, or Nepali temple hash, whatever it might be. You're going to smoke as much of this as you can, and then you're going to lie in silent darkness. And again, you're going to let the mind take over. And it's the imagination that it's all about. That's a key thing about Terence McKenna. The imagination is key. And this is the realm. This is the other world. This is the doorway to another dimension from which everything comes. All ideas, art, expression, brilliant inventions, innovations of human civilization, maybe human civilization itself. His notion was that it all in some way comes from the imagination, which is that thing inside your brain, which is the one part scientists don't really know much about. We don't really know what it is, what its purpose is, where this stuff's coming from, how you can take an idea out there, make it into a tangible thing in the world that could be like a jet engine and could fly out through the sky and carry people. These are incredible notions when you actually think about how ridiculous that is. And he's a guy where his approach was, even when smoking cannabis, he wants to have hallucinations. He wants to have near LSD-like strong experiences. I mean, he's a person who, if you look at the way he experienced drugs, it makes sense in terms of how his philosophy on life, which was life is about stressing and emphasizing what he called the felt presence of direct experience. It's about you experiencing it and seeing what it's like and understanding it. It's not about hearing it and thinking that's a cool idea or having someone relate something to you. Those have their own value, but it's a tertiary, a secondary value. The primary thing is the felt presence of direct experience, how something interacts with you. In this sense, it's no wonder he became interested in occultism and alchemy and hermetics, because he in that sense had a notion that was very similar to the Gnostics, these ancient Christians of the 1st and 2nd century, who didn't want to just listen to what God is like from a book or do a very simple ritual like having the Catholic Mass. No, they wanted to directly experience God themselves, have God interact with their brain in some way and change them through the experience. He's someone who could appreciate and understand that value and saw that that was a key element of human life, being a human essentially. I mean, famously, he would say about DMT, since it takes 10 or 15 minutes, in 10 or 15 minutes, you could be a different person. You could have gone and had an experience that other people simply haven't had. And you could, as a result, be your own, he would say, your own Magellan, your own Christopher Columbus, your own person exploring, in this case, the realms of your mind. Oh, in the case of psilocybin, it's going to be a few hours, obviously. And the key detail here is you're going to experience things outside the boundaries of your cultural programming. He often stressed how these things were ego-dissolving agents. They were boundary-dissolving agents. They took away the lines and the pens and the systems of thoughts and the ley lines of culture that have been imprinted upon you and let you just experience what is going on. He's a guy where he actually knew a lot about many other drugs as well. That's why I say in terms of pharmacology, he was a very interesting guy because, I mean, his brother literally is a scientist in that particular sense, but Terence McKenna is more like a historian of that stuff. He'd studied shamanism and the different drugs they use in different tribes around the world. I mean, interestingly enough, because of the timing of when he was alive, he didn't get super heavily into Salvia divinorum, which when they made it into a powdered version also became a very hardcore hallucinogenic like DMT in that sense. He had some experiences with it, but I noticed by that period in time in his life, he was someone who was a bit turned off by some of those intense experiences. So he didn't go too much into that. That mainly was a thing of the early 2000s. He was, interesting enough, for people who say he's a drug advocate, he was very much against what he called the white powder drugs, which ruin your life. Cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine. He wasn't someone who was a proponent of these or thought they were beneficial or thought they had a good impact on society. He's someone who, as part of his experiences with drugs and exploring the history of them, exposed what he would call the global con game of governments controlling and prohibiting drugs, but then at the same time profiting from their sale. He was there from the beginning of the counterculture in Berkeley, around Harvard in the 60s, where all this stuff was happening. and saw how the counterculture rose up, and then how society did put the lid back on all that shit and did get the genie back in the bottle somehow in the 70s and the 80s with this oppressive regime of the DEA, etc. And he's someone who considered that kind of controlling, specifically of the psychedelics, not the hard drugs, of not being about stopping people ruining their lives with drugs or drugs being a scourge. He saw this very, very clearly as a political and as a social issue, where what happens was governments didn't want you to be able to have these experiences, which would maybe perhaps provoke certain ideas, some of them being, for example, to question, because they're boundary dissolving, question the ideas of society, question government, question what you're allowed to do in your personal liberties. He felt that governments purposely restricted that so that you could not come to those conclusions, because if you did, some of the initial conclusions you would very likely come to would be, we shouldn't have government in this way. This is oppressive the way these things are done. We should live a different way. You know, modern capitalist industrial society is absurd in the way this is allowed to run. I mean, he often would stress, okay, that you're not allowed to smoke cannabis, even though it's fairly harmless in your own life. You're not allowed to take mushrooms, yet written into essentially the job charter of pretty much all industrial work in the West is you are allowed a drug break for a coffee break to take in caffeine, because caffeine is seen as a drug that is beneficial to the industrial process for perking your energy levels up again and allowing you to do more work, which is a cog in the machine, benefits industrial Western civilized society. And so this is a guy where he saw the hypocrisy of these things. This is a guy where he knew that people wouldn't buy into cultural notions as easily if psychedelics were out there. And also, he also observed that by seeing that these things are restricted and they're not a part of most people's lives, well, the absurdity of being alive is what causes problems, of this artifice of Western society and industrial culture and all living in cities, in hundreds of thousands of millions of people, in countries of hundreds of millions of people, and someone making decisions that dictate all the policies of your life, but they're 2,000 miles away. This is absurd. And then the life of, like, you're just going to have the 2 kids and the wife and the mortgage, and you're going to have your career, then you're going to retire, then you're going to do a little bit of something for a few years, then you're going to die. I mean, yeah, this is absurd. Is there any wonder where people have wig outs, they have midlife crisis, quarter life crisis, they don't know what the fuck's going on, they get drawn in by religions, and they're blowing the money everywhere, and they're having affairs, and everything's chaotic. This is because people are lacking something. And his notion was that the psychedelic experience was inherently tied together with being a human. I mean, he had this famous thing he would say, which is that imagine someone going through their life without ever having a sexual experience. Now, anyone who's had any experience with sex would know, yeah, well, you'd think totally differently about life and yourself and your gender and your purpose and the other gender and how society even works. You wouldn't understand some of kind of the underpinnings and the subtexts that are going on in every area of advertising and conversations and flirting. Yeah, in the same way you wouldn't know that, most people were going to the grave without the psychedelic experience. They weren't getting to see this aspect of the way the mind works and different thoughts you can have and questioning certain cultural aspects. And so to him, sure, if someone didn't want to have a sexual experience, they don't have to. In the same way, if someone doesn't want to have a psychedelic experience, they don't have to. But these are valid and vital things that are a part of the human experience, ultimately, if you look at human civilization and how long it's been around. This is a guy where he was very interested in tying his ideas, particularly with drugs, into human development and anthropology. I mean, he's someone who often would cite the notion of panspermia, which is the idea that perhaps life was seeded on Earth from another planet, from another galaxy, from another solar system. Because actually, interestingly enough, if you want to talk about the idea that DNA came here, or if you want to talk about different things, different life forms traveling through space, interestingly enough, a mushroom spore, in theory, could survive traveling through space. The harshness of space would not destroy a mushroom spore because it's incredibly dense. And so as a result, he would often say that the psilocybin mushroom, if you look at the chemical makeup, was the only, I forget the exact term, is the only one of us with like a certain chemical structure on Earth of that type. There's nothing else that's connected to it in exactly the same way. And so his notion was perhaps it came from another planet. No, he didn't say it did, by the way. He was saying this is an idea. Then his notion in terms of how mushrooms affected and psychedelics affected human culture was something called the stoned ape theory. And this was the notion that humans lived as apes in the canopy. And that what happened was they used to live in small tribes, And then they would have a cult of mushrooms where they would take mushrooms at a certain point every month, and they would have group sex, group orgies, because one of the things about taking mushrooms is at the initial stages, you do get an excitatory state in terms of that, which in the male, as he would say, means erection. And you would have this sex, and that as a result, first of all, you had these small cultures that were all tightly bound together by these experiences. Secondly, because people were having group sex, no one knew whose child was whose when they were born, because they've all had sex with each other. And so as a result, you have more of a communal feeling amongst people, because you have to take care of all the children. You don't have your child and yours, which is the leading of what he calls, as we'll lead into, dominator culture. Because his notion was, after they came out of the canopy, after the rainforest receded, and they were into these areas which were just the grasslands, they receded. Then we were in a situation where humans were getting less and less access to mushrooms, and now it became about, one of the interesting things is one of the early ways you could store something like mushrooms with honey, but then that could mean they could ferment and turn into alcohol. And alcohol is obviously the prevalent drug of humans ever since then, in his theory. And as a result, alcohol is more like an individualistic drug. This is a period where, without the connection to the mushroom, to this Gaian matrix, as he say, this communal, tribal aspect, now we get cities, and now it becomes agricultural, and now we store all the stuff together, and we have the people who go out, and we have our city, and my place, and my women, and my children, and they've got theirs and their city and theirs, and we go out, we conquer them, and it's all about identity and ego. And now we're not all in any way connected. Now we're very much apart, and now the dominator culture begins. Now it's about the strongest and the ones with the best tools and the ones with the ability and the might dominating the others and controlling what they do and what they think. And in this particular sense, and he draws the parallel to what apes are like baboons, etc., and what they're like in their cultures, and then what we're like now. And the middle point was the interaction with mushrooms. And he even says perhaps this had something to do with how the human brain size doubled over some period that no one's ever really been able to explain. It's one of the biggest mysteries in the history of biology in that sense. So there's also the notion of how humans and technology have interacted and grown together, and how this has influenced us. I mean, particularly in the modern day, he was very interested in the ideas of the informations theorist Marshall McLuhan, who was very much forgotten but was kind of revived in the 70s. This is a guy where he had some very interesting ideas about how, famously, the medium is the message, the way even watching a certain medium transmits information to you and becomes an extension of your mind and the way that you think about things. He's someone where, in terms of human culture, he was very interested in language, not just language in terms of different languages, but what can be said. I mean, obviously, in terms of his experience with DMT and hallucinogenics, it's key to have a very wide vocabulary and to have looked into a lot of different areas and have a lot to pull from to try and explain yourself. But also the notion of, what can you even say about things? The notion of a visual language, trying to create something where instead of describing what I would say to you, instead you would see what I'm saying. You would see what I'm thinking. He had this notion that telepathy, perfect telepathy, would be that you see what I'm thinking. It's not that you hear my voice inside your head telling you. I mean, he had a great saying. This one that really defines him, where it was a paraphrasing of William Blake, where he said, "If the truth can be told so as to be understood, it will be believed." And this is a very defining quote for if you look at the message of his life and what he was trying to do. He's someone where, as a result, if you love language, you love the idea of visual language, of poetry, of trying to convey complex ideas in these simple language artifacts. No wonder he was in love with James Joyce, and particularly Finnegan's Wake, which, again, like his talks, the more you bring to it, the more you study it, the more you invest into it, the more you will gain out of it. The more that there will be at the end, the more dividends you will reap. Because he was so interested in language, this is someone who, the imagination was everything for this guy. This is a guy who literally would say, imagination is everything. It's all about Borges and his fantastic short stories. It's all about Philip K. Dick and paranoia and identity and who are we and what are the different ways of thinking about life. This is someone where, it's no wonder he would refer to William Blake and that kind of like mystic view of the world, this visionary aspect of not just seeing something, but seeing what you experienced there, and not just the culturally defined labels that you could put over it. And as a result, this led him naturally down the lines to the occult, to hermeticism, to to alchemy as a particular area. Now, interestingly enough, he didn't go deep into the occult in terms of he wasn't a practicing magician. He didn't seem very interested in ceremonial magic or chaos magic in these senses. He didn't perform them, but he's very interested in the history of them because as ideas, they're very unique ways of looking at the world. And so he was very much someone who knew a lot about the history of this, particularly the fields of Renaissance magic and alchemy. If you talk about Terence McKenna in these fields, you have to bring up names like Giordano Bruno, Ficino, Campanelli, John Dee, Hermes Trismegistus, and the Asclepius. This is a guy where these were the areas he was going into, and he was most interested by these ideas, which go back hundreds of years, but in many ways, you listen to them now and they sound like philosophy from now. They sound like ideas that someone could come up with now because they're so vivid and so vital in some senses. He's a guy where he was a critic of science, despite the fact he also appreciated some of the aspects about science because he saw the limitations of science and the idea that science shouldn't be the one world view for everything and the metric by which everything is kind of judged. I mean, I'm reminded of the way Peter J. Carroll, the chaos magician thinker, often describes science as the area of things which can be studied, which have high probabilities of occurring in the same way. And areas that are very low probabilities are magic. They're areas of aspects you can't explain and that don't have this set pattern of always being very similar in that particular sense. Terence McKenna would buy into that kind of a mentality. And interestingly enough, one of the things he often would cite as a way of talking about this is he would talk about the history of how science came fairly recently into the forefront of being the main way of thinking about the world. And one of the key people who was one of the fathers of science, obviously, is René Descartes. The whole thing of cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Well, here's the thing. If you look into the history of Descartes, says McKenna, you find this story about how Descartes was out there as a soldier in, I think it was the Swiss army or the French army? One of these armies, okay? He was out there in an army. And as a young guy wenching his way around Europe, he had a dream one night that an angel came to him and said to him something like the measure of nature can be found by recording its note and its rote or something like this, essentially suggesting like you can chart all these things in a scientific manner and then this is what science comes out. So science comes out, as he often suggested, you had magic, you had science, you had religion, and actually it was science and magic or mysticism that were connected the most closely, and it was religion that was against them. That's why they were pushed underground in the Dark Ages, and why so much of them went underground, for example, into Islamic cultures, where they allowed it to remain through Sufi traditions, etc., and was having to be done, like the alchemists, through code and hidden so that you don't get killed by the Inquisition. And now later on, science splits apart from mysticism, becomes its own thing, denies mysticism exists, denies religion is anything, takes over completely, and to some degree now, through secular values, has destroyed them and suppressed all of them. Whereas mysticism is simply a different way of looking at experiences in the world that you can't account for through the religious impulse or the scientific accounting of nature and looking for patterns and equations. I mean, this is one of the reasons why he found Giordano Bruno, John Dee so interesting. Because these were guys who were leading scientific thinkers, but who were heavily invested in the notions of the occult and Hermeticism. I mean, John Dee obviously communicating with what were then later called the Enochian angels through his work with Edward Kelly. Giordano Bruno, if you look into some of the things that Dame Frances Yates wrote about in her book about him, where he was exploring the art of memory and the way that you could construct a mind palace to be able to think and to hold information that otherwise didn't seem possible at the time without computers and without necessarily the same access to books, and the printing press wasn't as widespread. This is a guy where his notion of the love of ideas and new frontiers and fringe areas took him into virtual reality and the internet when it had only just begun in the mid-90s. This is a guy who saw the possibilities of these things, what they might be one day. Now, sure, like many people from the 70s thinking about futuristic ideas, he was very utopian in how he saw them, and some of those things haven't happened. But I actually think if you listen to his talks, he did, to some degree, kind of foresee a world where you would have like Facebook-type pages, and you would have areas of lists that you were all interested in. And he saw the genius of the hyperlink before almost anyone else did, the idea that you didn't have to store all the information on your server and your website. You could link to it, and therefore we could have the most efficient way to store all the information on this World Wide Web long before everyone was on there. And by the way, for stuff like Facebook, that wasn't a thing that existed back in the 90s. This was an idea that no one thought would go to that level. I remember when, for example, before there was Facebook, in gaming, we had Geek Boys, So Game, that was invented by BDS, and this was like a Facebook for gamers with profiles, and this was a revolutionary idea and really changed the way people connected and could meet players and follow people's lives, etc. This is a guy where epistemology was a very important topic to him. I mean, we're talking about the theory of what can be known. What are the methods? What is the validity of things we think we know? What is the scope of what we can even know? And so he always wanted to talk about, what can humans even know? What do we actually know? What can be known? Are certain things impossible? Will we always be agnostic about certain things in some sense? He had a great line he would always say, which I always think about when I think about the absurdity of humans thinking how much they know, which is that we are talking monkeys communicating with small mouth noises which cause little vibrations in the air to go into the other person's ear and tingle on their drum, the drum of their ear, and that transforms in their mind into words and pictures that we all just think correspond to the exact same dictionary, but very likely are all slightly different or sometimes radically different. And this causes, like, think about how much communication ends in miscommunication. The person not getting the right idea, the person arguing with you, and sometimes you argue with the person for 2 or 3 hours, or you go into and at the end you find out, actually, we agree on some things, we think similarly, and that's your inability to communicate with each other, because what's inside the mind, this is almost a Hindu idea, the experience, the way an idea appears in your mind is not with words. It's not with images directly in the sense that you could draw the image. And what happens is, as you download those, as you go to lower levels of trying to express the idea, something is lost at each stage. And therefore, when the other person tries to recompile it, something's missing. And unless they've had the same experiences, they can't insert what's missing, the kind of the junk DNA, as it were, of that particular strand to be able to have the same thought in their mind that you had in theirs. He had a great line he used to say about, imagine if you met a termite that told you he wanted to know the secrets of the universe. Now you'd look at that termite and go, you're out of your mind. Come on, man, look at you. You're just a termite. You live in a like termite nest. You know, you chew wood. You only live a little while. You're never going to understand that. In fact, you probably can't understand that. Yet we look around ourselves and we think as humans that we not only do understand these things, but that we can understand anything, and that anything can be known, and we can figure it all out, and technology will take us all there. And this is another idea he would often go into, is that, yes, technology exists and is to be celebrated, but just as science isn't the only way to the world, technology isn't. Humans have become obsessed with this like demon of techne, this notion that because we can technologically do things, that means that our consciousness is at the level of that, and everyone using those tools is at the level of that, and therefore we've all advanced. Yet you go back and you read the words of Marcus Aurelius and the ideas this guy's talking about, or Confucius, and you find these guys, because they've gone very far intellectually themselves, they're ahead of any average person you meet. They're having ideas that are profound and paradigm-shattering for any modern person who has access to far more technology. One of the things I've always hated that I took from Terence McKenna, just as a notion, is when people will say, but then again, you know, what did the Mayans know? I mean, they didn't even have shoes. As though having shoes then means that you have also accessed all the other knowledge and the ways of thinking and the wisdom of everything else about that particular culture or society or the great thinkers, because someone invented shoes and you wear them, and therefore your feet aren't dirty to the same degree. That's kind of the hubris of modern society, and this is something he would stress and he would point out in his model of how he thought about things. A key topic, if you're going to talk about the way a lot of his talks went, is eschatology. It's that aspect of what is going to happen when we die. Is there a final judgment? Is there some destiny for the soul, for what will happen to the human species? This is something that was very important to him, because obviously this is leading to the future. He talks about the past, he talks about the present, but the future is also a key topic in his discussions, because he's someone who did have a notion about the singularity, but it was a different one. He had a notion that the singularity, rather than the universe being started by a big bang, like a singularity that explodes out, and it's this key moment, this object that it becomes everything, the whole known universe, everything that ever exists in it, all matter, all energy, rather than it all coming out of that. His notion was that there was this, what he called the transcendental object at the end of time, or the end of history, he would often say. And instead, it was the strange attractor dragging us towards it. And history was the nightmare from which we were going to awaken at the point where we reached the end of history, this transcendental object. Now, what that meant, there was many different ways you could go with it. This is where the time wave zero came in. This notion of novelty theory, that on December 21st, 2012, history would come to an end. Maybe that meant a time machine appears and everything, at that point, everyone can go back and forwards to every point in time. Maybe that meant at that point in time, somehow human intellect reaches the level where all information is simultaneously knowable and accessible at all points in time. Now, these are all very sci-fi ideas, obviously incredible ideas, but seem unlikely. And obviously, many people would say that didn't happen on December 21st, 2012. Now, I will say that is an area where he did fuck around a bit. Like, he did even admit at certain points in time, and people have said later, that he did actually find a different date at the end of his King Wen sequence thing where he made time zero, and it wasn't December 21st, but when he found out about the Mayans and their calendar ending around this time, in a certain cycle, I forget which one it was, Then he changed it to this date. So there was some fuckery on that end, but I think he just did that to market the idea. So I'm not that comfortable with that aspect of it, but it's just a piece of it. Now, as a concept, though, this notion of novelty theory and how it affects it, I do think as a concept is very interesting. I think actually, if you were to chart history differently, I would put the singularity at some point either in the past or in the future with the internet. Because I think with the internet, you will literally have a point in time where all information in theory that has ever been known by humans one day will be on the internet and will be accessible at the speed of light, so in an instant, to all locations and all places on the human earth. And then if we go out to other planets, etc. So you can already see how that's an incredibly sci-fi idea. In fact, this is something that Terence McKenna would often stress, is that through technology, we had actually accomplished most of what were the alchemist's dreams. So remember, one of the alchemist's dreams that everyone laughs at them is, they wanted to turn lead into gold. You can turn lead into gold. If you have some kind of a machine that can move atoms around and create new elements, you can create gold out of lead. Now, the problem is you wouldn't do it, except for as an experiment, because it will cost immeasurably more than some gold would. But it can now be actually accomplished, what their dream was. Likewise, this notion of telepathy or being able to see from great distances or access massive amounts of information, the Akashic record, etc. All these hermetic ideas were actually accomplished by technology. They exist now, and they just don't seem like such far-fetched ideas to you or I because they actually exist at this point in time. I mean, it reminds me of, I think it's Aleister Crowley's introduction to the Goetia, where he describes how all the things the Goetia can promise to be able to do, like, destroy your enemies, to let you have telepathic knowledge of stuff. All these things, if you reinterpret them into modern language, can be done. So, for example, to destroy your enemies, well, rather than magic literally destroying them, maybe it can change the way your mind models your enemy so that you actually don't think of him as an enemy anymore. In that sense, he no longer is an enemy. You don't think of him as entirely separate from yourself. You see him in reaction to what you're doing yourself, and therefore you have destroyed it. They are no longer your enemies. They are no longer threats to you, and you have now found a way to experience them in a different manner and to maybe to interact with them. So it's this kind of a sense that all of these dreams were possible. It's just that when we look at the archaic language, what we don't realize is we're laughing at the absurdity of the archaic language and the fact that they can't express their modern ideas, but modern ideas like this exist and have been done. This is another core concept. That's why he doesn't just dismiss the past in some silly manner of like, again, oh, these were just primitive people who didn't understand anything. And he understands that the religious dressing that's put on it is part of their culture of their day, in the same way as the scientific dressing that we use now is our culture. That is the water that we as fish swim in and don't realize is water, and we just think this is the environment, and there is no such thing as water. He's someone where he often talked about the future of civilization, the human civilization, in terms of what would happen with space travel, what would happen when oil ran out and technology got to a certain level. He's someone where he always tied in all these concepts. So it was the concept of, is there a soul? What is a soul? What is the person outside of their culturally defined identity and outside of thinking of the world in a certain sense? And is there something beyond that that observes that, as you'll find in the realms of meditation, they often describe this. And he had this great saying where he called the human being as somewhere partly between a monkey and an angel. It's the idea of the angel in the monkey, or both simultaneously, or the human being being some meeting point between the two, some Venn diagram cross-section. That's what the human being is in some sense. Now, interestingly enough, there were some things that people were critical of him after he died that were interesting, but I don't know how much water they hold. So one of them is the notion that people say, I mean, it's actually a particular guy who's done a bunch of work in this area, but I have to say, doesn't necessarily seem like necessarily the most stable individual, and I have a lot of qualms about the way he interpreted some of this material. He claims that Terence McKenna was actually some sort of psyop, that he was some sort of CIA agent who was sent to infiltrate the counterculture and spread these ideas in a certain sense, presumably for the New World Order and the Illuminati and all that good shit. Now, that's something that personally, I haven't seen any compelling evidence for that. It looks like one guy's theory, and as usual, when one person gets a very subjective theory, it's all about their interpretation of this, which they then build into the next interpretation and the next interpretation. And if you don't agree with or find merit or validity to the initial interpretations, the whole house of cards collapses, where for them, it's some cast iron proof. Another aspect is that it came out years later, people said, friends of his acquaintances, that he had not done mushrooms or psychedelics since 1988. And remember, he died in 2000. So they're saying for 12 years, he continued to do talks and discuss these matters, but he hadn't been taking the drugs himself. And so the implication there is that he was a sham, and that he was someone who was selling a false idea, and he should have come clean and said that he hadn't done it. And that it all stemmed from this terrible experience that he had when he and his then wife, he later married someone else called Kathleen Harrison, Kat McKenna, in 1988 or 1989, they took mushrooms and had an experience which led to some sort of existential crisis in him, where when what had been this wise teaching spirit of the mushroom kind of pulled back, it revealed this abyss of nothing, of this pure void. It was described as a lack of all meaning. And this was such a terrifying notion that supposedly it put him off doing psychedelics again for the rest of his life. But he never spoke about it in public. Now, he did. This is one of the issues, okay? First of all, there are conflicting reports. First of all, he did an interview himself in 1999 before he died called Terence McKenna Speaks, which was by John Hanna and Sylvia Thyssen. And it was at the All Chemical Arts Conference on Kona Coast, Hawaii, in which he actually said that, okay, he'd cut back on cannabis because he was having seizures because of his cancer at the time, but that he had, he had been taking psilocybin, and that he'd been taking it as pure psilocybin and not mushrooms, and that he was having good experiences with it. Also, someone called Mark Schwann came forwards, and he actually said, after this information came out, that he had taken mushrooms with Terence McKenna in 1996 in Africa, and that Terence had said that he'd broken the rules by taking them at that point in time, because presumably he had in general sworn off them. So as a result, there are multiple sources discrediting it. And this information originally came from the initial draft, the manuscript, of a book by Dennis McKenna, Terence's younger brother, that he was going to publish. And it was before it had been published. And he gave the notes of the manuscript to this guy, I think it was Bruce Damer, who's another psychedelic thinker. And Bruce Damer did a podcast called A Deep Dive into the Mind of McKenna or something. It'll be on YouTube, which was later taken down at the request of the family. And because it was found not to be entirely correct, in which, in kind of a bit of a condescending way, they constantly kind of chide and chastised Terence for not, as a result, facing his demons or acknowledging his problems and his weaknesses and stuff because he shied away from it. But interestingly enough, even Dennis McKenna himself later, and I'll link an interview up here, actually talked about in an interview that he did do mushrooms later on. He did them less often. He did psychedelics less often, but he did still do them. It's just that he started to do them less and less over the years. And actually, Terence himself, here's another video, talked about mushrooms he had taken in the 90s, for example, in 1996. Now, the big problem with all of that is, first and foremost, anyone who's had a lot of experience with psychedelics will probably know the Alan Watt line, a great philosopher, which is, once you've got the message, hang up the phone. It's the idea that once you get the message and once you've thought a certain way from psychedelics, you might not need psychedelics anymore. They'll no longer be a tool you need, so you might be able to stop doing them. And actually, this is something that you see throughout history in this particular sense. So when the idea that Terence stopped doing them because he was just scared by them and he was a sham, not necessarily. I don't really buy that as like a way to just paint it black and white. Now, first of all, the implication that he advocated for something he himself wouldn't do and was scared to do by calling it heroic dose, no, that's not the case at all. In fact, he didn't say do that. He didn't say go and do this heroic dose. He just described that this to him was the ultimate experience of psychedelics. He would talk about the fact that he knew DMT users that would say, oh, my favorite drug's DMT. And you'd say, oh, right, when's the last time you did it? And they'd say 1975. And the notion was that, they hadn't needed to do it since then, despite how powerful an experience it had been. He also would say how, when he would go into the DMT world, the DMT tykes would say to him, oh, you send so many, but come so rarely. So he openly is admitting he doesn't actually do it that often, and he's not involved in it that often. He's someone where he would often say how a friend of his would say, when you took mushrooms, the goal was not that it got easy and that you would have a great time and you'd get experience. The notion is that every time there would be work, every time it would be resistance and difficult experiences, and that it was to go back and to stand a bit more every time. This was the actual notion that was important overall. So he wasn't someone who was out there proselytizing, telling anyone and everyone to use 5 dry grams of mushrooms in silent darkness. Absolutely not. That is not the message I've taken from listening to hundreds of hours of his material over and over. He's someone who actually often advocated a world in which instead there would be experts and places that people would be able to do these things. His main reason for wanting psychedelics decriminalized was to allow research to be done on them, not just for everyone to be able to take them. He's someone where, he did say it was similar to sex in a sense that it's an important part of the human experience, and many people are probably missing out on it who maybe should be able to access this particular dimension. But that's also because he saw so much of human culture and human art coming out of this area. It reminds me actually more, rather than just willy-nilly telling everyone to do it, in fact, I think people have tarred him with the Leary thing there, of tune in, drop out, all that stuff. It reminds me more of the way Robert Anton Wilson, another great counterculture figure, used to talk about the occult and ceremonial magic. He would say that with the kind of Golden Dawn Kabbalistic ceremonial magic, that Israel Regardie, famously one of the secretaries of Aleister Crowley, a mystic of the early 20th century, he would actually tell people and advise them not to do Kabbalistic type magic unless they'd had years of psychotherapy and later on learned actually some aspects of general semantics, which is a way of thinking about the world and modeling the world and kind of a way of being sane in what's otherwise an irrational human monkey mind. And so actually they advocated this before you ever got involved in it, so that you wouldn't wig out and you wouldn't flip out, you wouldn't become seemingly crazy, you wouldn't become completely unraveled and ruin your whole life. They thought this was important because otherwise people do end up in mental asylums, because to me, magic and psychedelics to some degree are like trying to reprogram your brain. Well, guess what? If you try to reprogram a computer and you're an expert at it and you learn all the steps of it and you're very careful, you might be able to reprogram your computer to do amazing things and better things than it was before. But if you just go in there willy-nilly with no understanding and start fucking around in the BIOS and reprogramming the operating system, you might fuck up your whole computer so that you personally can't fix it. It's broken, and because in our society we don't have this openness to research for psychedelics, there won't be some expert who can come in and fix your brain for you and reprogram it all necessarily in the same way like you would just do if your computer was broken in this way. That's the metaphor I would use, and that's kind of the way I saw him proposing psychedelics and the importance of them in the world. I mean, interestingly enough, when you talk about his brother saying those things, this is a guy where the recent family of Terence McKenna actually withdrew from his brother a lot. They were upset with him over saying these things, his kids and his wife. They cut off all ties with him. That's what he mentioned in that 2015 interview. And as a result, Dennis McKenna took a lot of that stuff out of his book. Now, I don't think Terence McKenna recommended and advocated people just use psychedelics. I personally don't recommend psychedelics myself. Now, I don't say you shouldn't do it. I don't advocate or recommend anything in my life. Any movie, art, experience, transformative thing that you can do with your life, drug, anything. I think everyone is different. I think everyone has to find what works for them. Everyone has to test things out, and everyone has to figure out if it's the wrong line of avenue of research, don't go down that area, because obviously certain things can be dangerous to certain people. So all I can do is say what's worked for me, what didn't work for me, and transmit my experience. And what other people do with that is up to them. And they should, as Terence McKenna would have probably actually said, you should take responsibility for your own life. And you shouldn't look for other figures to tell you what to do and tell you what is good. You should be determining and questioning everything that they say. I mean, to use the Timothy Leary line, think for yourself, question authority. This is a great line to live by in many ways in life. And yet people portray Timothy Leary as just this guru who told everyone to do drugs and go crazy and wig out and leave society. If you listen to that ultimate message, you wouldn't necessarily do that unless it's something you wanted to do anyway. I do think actually personally that psychedelics and magic, by the way, the occult, are areas that people do tend to rush into without having done enough basic groundwork, without researching, without knowing who they are themselves enough, without having actually investigated even what the effects might be and some of the other aspects and how to deal with it and how to set it up properly and in a responsible manner to have the set and the setting and the time available to do these things and perhaps a sitter. With that said though, at the same time, you can't ever really know necessarily how the experience is going to be because you haven't had the experience yet. Much like the sexual experience, no amount of reading or watching videos or listening to other people's experiences will prepare you or make you an expert at navigating the experience itself. It's something that you can only start to get that kind of like those rungs on the ladder. You can only go up them once you've had the experience yourself. That's the only time you can know what the effect will be on you personally and your personal laboratory, your own biological organism and your mind, obviously. I mean, Terence McKenna, to bring it all back, this was a man for all seasons. This is a guy who could play that role of a mentor, who could be a friend you could listen to and you could go back to, and you can't talk to him because he's just in videos and he's just in MP3s and he's audio files and he's just in books and written articles. But his ideas are always there and you can always access them. He was this sane voice to some degree. I mean, he'd admit himself that wasn't sane in that particular sense. Sane voice in what is otherwise an absurd and insane world in many ways. An absurd society. And the more you bring to the table, the more you can take away from it. I mean, it reminds me in some senses of where in the Superman mythos, Superman goes to his Fortress of Solitude and he uses those old crystals on the Kryptonian computer to access the wisdom of his father Jor-El and of the Kryptonian civilization. Now, they can't provide any new information. They can't do anything different. It's all there already. But the idea is as he grows as a man, as he has different experiences, as he's ready to take some new information, then he goes back and experiences it, and he returns to it, and he takes some solace in this, and it's something that challenges him but provides him with like companionship as well, and connects him back to a certain matrix of knowledge. So in terms of Terence McKenna, I would say when you go out there and you listen to his talks and you read his things, don't just take them as fabulous ideas, don't just take them as wonderful things and entertainment. Take the same advice he would say that the Tykes told him in the DMT dimension when he was in the dome, when he'd gone past the chrysanthemum. It's do not give in to astonishment. Don't just marvel at what a great talker he is. Let the ideas soak in. Think about them. Test them out, challenge them. Ask yourself, do you really think that? If he has interesting ideas, follow them up, read those books, listen to future talks, come back, listen to it again, see what the effect is on you, if it's something you're interested in. So Terence McKenna is someone where he was this bard, this mythic Irish bard holding forth on ideas and imagination. He was this teller of secrets, large and small. He was this dreamer of impossible dreams, which shall yet become. He was a seeker of the lapis, of the philosopher's stone. He was someone who understood that life and most experiences are this coincidentia oppositorum, the coincidence of opposites, the union of opposites, and that nothing exists but in the presence of its opposite. As above, so below.